At 4:32 in the morning, Bumpy Johnson walked down a basement staircase knowing 12 men were waiting for him with their guns already drawn, knowing there were no witnesses, no exits, and no second chances. 90 minutes later, only one of those men would walk back up, carrying a message so precise it would stop a war before it started. This is the night Harlem changed hands without a single deal being signed. The silence hit him the moment his foot touched the top stair, the kind that doesn't wait to be explained. The basement air was stale and tight, thick with old smoke and spilled liquor, and a single bulb hanging from the ceiling swayed just enough to keep the shadows moving. He didn't pause, didn't call out, didn't reach for anything, because hesitation would have turned suspicion into certainty. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound, wood meeting wood, and the basement became sealed. Crates lined the walls, poker tables pushed aside, bottles stacked in careless towers, and one narrow staircase that now belonged to someone else. Bumpy took 2 more steps down and stopped, standing where the light cut his shoulders but left his hands in shadow. That's when he heard it. Not voices, not footsteps, just the clean, mechanical clicks of safeties being taken off, one after another, slow and deliberate, until the room seemed to count them for him. 12. Men unfolded from the darkness as if they'd been there the whole time, coats open, guns already leveled, faces calm in the way only practiced killers ever look. He recognized some by reputation alone, names whispered after funerals, men who didn't miss and didn't talk. One stepped forward just enough for the light to catch his smile. "Dutch sends his regards." Bumpy looked at him the way he looked at everything, carefully, without urgency, his eyes moving from face to face, counting again, confirming what he already knew. He took in the spacing, the angles, the way 2 men stood too close together near the tables, the way the staircase was covered without being crowded. When his gaze returned to the man in front, his expression hadn't changed. "That all he sent?" The smile faltered, just slightly, the kind of crack men feel before they know why. Someone shifted their feet, boots scraping wood, and a gun barrel dipped before correcting itself. The man in front raised his weapon higher, compensating for the room's sudden uncertainty. "You got about 5 seconds to beg," he said. "After that, this gets ugly." Bumpy tilted his head, not in defiance, but as if listening for something only he could hear. "You're making a mistake." A short laugh cut through the room, sharp and humorless. "You're about to be dead." "The mistake," Bumpy said, his voice low and even, "is thinking I came here blind." No one fired. They should have, but they didn't, because something had shifted that didn't belong to any one man. Fingers tightened on triggers, then loosened, eyes flicked toward the staircase and back again, each waiting for someone else to decide. The bulb swung wider, casting the light in longer arcs, turning faces into masks and then back into men. "You bluffing," the man said, though it came out more like a question. Bumpy didn't answer right away. He stood where he was, breathing steady, hands still empty, as if time itself had slowed for him. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud, and it wasn't rushed. "Then shoot." For a moment, the basement held its breath. 12 guns aimed at one man who hadn't moved an inch, the light swinging above them like a metronome counting down to something none of them could stop. The mistake that led Bumpy into that basement didn't begin that morning, and it didn't begin with Dutch Schultz. It began months earlier, when Harlem stopped being a promise and became a pressure cooker. Men lined up before dawn to place bets they couldn't afford, women counted nickels like prayers, and every runner knew the numbers weren't gambling anymore, they were survival. Money moved fast in Harlem, but respect moved slower, and outsiders never understood the difference. You could steal cash with a gun, but you couldn't steal loyalty without paying for it afterward. That loyalty flowed upward, through runners and collectors, until it landed in the hands of Madame Stephanie Street Clare. who ran her operation like a business and defended it like a country. Bumpy Johnson was the reason it stayed defended. When runners got hit, the money came back. When police leaned too hard on black-owned storefronts, their supervisors started asking uncomfortable questions. It didn't always end with blood, but it always ended. Harlem learned that calm was safer than panic, and that safety became power. Dutch Schultz saw none of that. What he saw was math. Prohibition was dying, the bottles were drying up, and Harlem's numbers racket looked like a river that never stopped flowing. Dutch had made his name breaking men faster than they could replace themselves, and he believed the same rules applied everywhere. Pay tribute or get buried. In January of 1933, he sent men south with smiles instead of guns, emissaries dressed well enough to pretend this was business. They sat across from Madame Street Claire in her club, spoke politely, and explained how the future worked. Dutch would take a cut, protection would be provided, and everyone would sleep easier. Madame Street Claire didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She let them finish, then told them to leave. The room didn't change, but something in it settled, like dust after a door closes. One of the men glanced toward the corner, where Bumpy stood without moving, hands folded, eyes steady. "You want to be smart about this," the emissary said. Bumpy didn't answer. He didn't need to. The stare did the talking. The emissaries left Harlem with their suits intact and their pride damaged beyond repair. When they told Dutch how the meeting had gone, he didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He listened, nodded once, and decided the problem wasn't Madame Street Claire. It was the man who made saying no feel safe. Dutch didn't want Bumpy dead quietly. Quiet deaths get forgotten. He wanted a death that echoed, one that happened where people talked, where people remembered, where people learned. Valentine's Day felt appropriate. When the tip reached Bumpy that Dutch's crew was planning a hit on the main counting house at dawn, he didn't call for backup. He didn't warn the runners. He put on his coat and went to look for himself. If Dutch wanted a message, Bumpy intended to hear it firsthand. The Cotton Club basement was open late, the kind of place that didn't ask questions. By the time Bumpy reached the door, the sky was thinning toward morning. He paused just long enough to listen, then went down the stairs alone, carrying the weight of a neighborhood that had decided not to kneel. The room tightened the moment Bumpy said nothing. 12 guns stayed trained on him, arms stiff, muscles locked, waiting for a signal that didn't come. The bulb swung wider, its light cutting across faces that had stopped smiling. "Last chance," the man said. "This don't have to hurt." "It already does," Bumpy replied. The words landed heavier than a threat. A finger tightened on a trigger, metal creaked, and the basement seemed to lean forward. That was when Bumpy moved. He didn't reach for a gun. He stepped forward and drove his fist into the bulb, glass exploding in a brief white flash before the room collapsed into darkness. Shots came instantly, wild and blind, ripping through crates and tables as men fired at sound instead of shape. "Hold your fire." Another shot cut him off. Wood splintered. A body hit the floor hard enough to steal the air from someone nearby. Men stumbled, cursed, fired at nothing, the space turning hostile and unfamiliar. Bumpy moved where the noise wasn't. He slid along the wall, hands open, steps measured, using confusion like a weapon. One man went down with a sharp grunt as Bumpy drove him into a stack of crates. Another swung blindly and caught air before his legs were taken out from under him. Gunfire echoed, flashes lighting the room in violent snapshots. In those flashes, men fired at the wrong shapes anyway. Screams followed, then pleading, then silence. Someone crawled toward the staircase, hands slipping in spilled liquor, breath coming ragged. Bumpy was already there. He didn't speak. The sound of a body hitting the steps ended the attempt, followed by a wheeze that never found its rhythm again. Above it all, someone tried to shout orders, but leadership dies fast in the dark. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. When the last shot echoed into nothing, what remained was uneven breathing from a single corner. Bumpy stood still, listening, letting the silence settle back into place. He didn't finish the man. He stepped past him instead, climbed the stairs, and disappeared into the thinning morning without looking back. In the basement, surrounded by bodies and broken plans, one survivor understood that living had been part of the message. The man didn't stand when the noise stopped. He stayed pressed against the wall, gun still in his hand, lungs pulling air like they didn't trust it to last. Around him, the room smelled of cordite and splintered wood. It took him nearly 20 minutes to crawl up the stairs. Each step sent pain through his ribs, sharp enough to blur his vision, but fear kept him moving. When he reached the street, Harlem was already waking up like nothing had happened. He flagged a cab with shaking hands and blood-soaked bills. "Bronx," he said. "Arthur Avenue." The driver didn't ask questions. Breakfast was being served when he reached the club. Plates clinked. Coffee steamed. Dutch Schultz sat in his shirt sleeves, newspaper folded beside him, chewing slowly. The door opened, and the room froze. The man stumbled inside, face gray, clothes stiff with blood. Conversations died. Hands drifted toward jackets. Dutch looked up last. "Where are the others?" he asked. "Dead," the man said. Then, quieter, "Down. All of them." Dutch stood. "All." The man nodded. "He let me live." That landed heavier than the word dead. The room went still enough to hear breath again. "Why?" Dutch asked. "Would he do that?" The man reached into his jacket. Guns cleared leather, but he pulled out only a single card, the ace of spades, bent and smeared with blood. He placed it on the table. "He said Harlem's not for sale," he whispered. "And if you send more men, send more cards. He's collecting a deck." Dutch stared at the card for a long time. Then he picked it up, turned it once, and smiled without warmth. "He's got nerve," he said. One of his men started to speak. Dutch raised a hand. "You know what it costs to fight someone who isn't afraid to die," he said. "Someone smart enough to humiliate you instead." He dropped the card into an ashtray and lit it. "It costs everything." When the card burned down, Dutch crushed it out and stood. "We're done in Harlem," he said. "Let him have it." No orders followed. None were needed. Years later, people argued about what really happened in that basement. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that after that morning, no one sent another crew into Harlem without permission, and no one questioned who gave it. On February 14, 1933, 12 men walked into a basement, one walked out, and power changed hands without a war. If you want the rest of the story's history softened or skipped, you know where to find them.